All right, this is, I'm going to read to you information about the book or the short story Gang Girl by Isis Sapp Grant. I'm going to start here. This is a picture of her, I believe. Isis Sapp Grant is a former member of the Deceptinettes, a girl gang in New York City. She is now a social worker who works with children who are at risk of joining gangs. Rosemarie Ramatham is an editor for Essence. So that must be the person who wrote about her, okay? Her mother named her Isis after the Egyptian goddess of fertility and protection. And indeed, the young woman with waist-length dreads was once an adolescent to whom other teenagers paid a kind of homage and money for protection. She has become a woman since then, a statuesque beauty, her cheekbones finely etched, her dark eyes slanted upward, her skin a deep, polished brown. Today, Isis Sapp Grant laughs easily, and yet there is a ghost of sadness on the high plane of her forehead, an unsurprised wariness in the depths of her eyes. A decade ago, she was the female leader of one of New York City's most notorious high school gangs, the Deceptinettes, and violence was the routine of her day. Now 27, Isis has become a clinical social worker whose primary focus is young gang members. Though her history still pains her, she views it as the fire in which her life's purpose was forged. She shares her story in the hope that it will help others understand the forces that lure teenagers into the deadly spiral of gang violence. So remember, as we're reading through this, she would be the main character, Isis. And so you want to pay attention to how she might change from the beginning of the story until the end of the story. I didn't set out to join, let alone start, one of the most fearsome girl gangs in the city. But there I was, me and my girls, the Deceptinettes, sisters of the male Decepticons, Decepts for short. The name was inspired by a silly Saturday morning cartoon, Transformers, which pitted the Decepticons, who were the bad guys, against the Autobots, who were the law enforcers. This was 1986, and I was 15 years old, living in Brooklyn with my mother, who was a social worker, and my three sisters, who at the time were 18, 14, and 2. My father wasn't around much. He and my mother were divorced. I just started at the High School of Graphic Communication Arts in Manhattan. My sisters were at different schools, and fortunately, they never got pulled into gangs. My personality was just different from theirs. I was more of a scrapper, always challenging my mother. As a kid, I thought I knew everything. I felt so powerful inside, and I couldn't understand why my mother didn't see that. She'd say, "Isis, why are you always trying to act bigger than you are?" I craved recognition. So by high school, I was ripe for anything that would give me that feeling of power, and that turned out to be Decept. So at the beginning, when she's in the gang, she likes the feeling of the power of it, right? Fighting for respect. The Decepticon gang started in the early 1980s at Brooklyn Tech, one of the top high schools in New York City. The male gang leader, Derek, aka Megatron, became my boyfriend at one point. He was an honor student before he eventually got shot in the head and became paralyzed. Like Derek, when I first got into Decept, I didn't have a clue I'd be in for that kind of violence. I was mostly thinking about protecting myself. I realized quickly that there were a lot of violent kids at school, but if I acted crazy, they kept their distance. And I found that the crazier I acted, the more respect I got. Some of the other girls who were new to the school noticed it too, and started hanging with me. We weren't really a gang, just friends, but we let it be known that if you messed with us, we would fight back, and that's how it started. There were about 10 of us in the beginning, but soon more girls joined us, and other kids in the school began giving us money to protect them. A lot of us lived in Brooklyn and knew some of the Decepticons. They would back us up in fights sometimes. After a while, we decided to officially join forces with the guys and call ourselves the Deceptinettes. Our ranks grew to about 70 over the next 3 years. That's how long I stayed in the gang. In all, there were several hundred Decept members, mostly male, at high schools throughout the city. We called our main headquarters, Derek's School, Cybertron, like in the cartoon, and our favorite gathering place was this park we called Signs of the Times. We even had a hand signal that we copied from the cartoon. In the beginning, Decept meetings were just a group of mostly Black and Hispanic teenagers hanging with their friends. The only problem was, to get respect on the street, we had to act like bad, and things just escalated from there. The first time I ever robbed someone was on Halloween, a couple of months after I started high school. On this particular day, 50 or more Decepts decided to cut class and congregate in the park. And everybody was drinking Cisco and getting restless and mean. The next thing I remember, we went down into the nearby subway station and started racing up and down the platform, through the trains, robbing people, grabbing their stuff, beating them up if they resisted. I did it too. I felt no boundaries, just this mad adrenaline rush. And at the time, I really liked the feeling that no one could mess with me, that I was invincible. Anything I wanted was mine. I went home that evening with rings and gold chains and Louis Vuitton bags, and my mother didn't even notice. I knew she was having her own problems. I think she was depressed. Even though she had been a good mother to me and my sisters till then, she wasn't really paying attention to what I was getting into. And my sisters took their cue from her and left me alone. Getting high on violence. That night, I spread on my bed all the stuff I had stolen, and I was just amazed. I thought that was too easy. After that, the violence really kicked in. And once it started, we couldn't stop because people were looking to get revenge on us, so we had to keep fighting just to protect ourselves. Plus, I think we really wanted to hurt people, as terrible as that sounds. We would play this game called One Punch Knockout. We'd stand outside the subway station and choose somebody and try to knock them out with one punch. I was good at that. Or we would sit around outside the school. We hardly ever went inside for classes anymore and come up with ways to just mess with folks. By then, our rep had gotten so far out there that most people just gave us whatever we wanted. It was at the point where we could close down any school by calling the school office and telling them Deceps were coming. People were that scared. But they needed to be scared. We would get high on the violence. People were getting killed over the most stupid. I remember the first time I saw somebody die. We had beat up this boy's sister. And that night we were partying at some club. People were high out of their minds. And here comes this boy talking about, leave my sister alone. This Jamaican guy I had a crush on, Frankie, he's like, just go away, man. You don't know what you're getting into. Just go. But the boy wouldn't leave. And some of the Decept girls started hitting him with baseball bats and hammers. Then the guys came outside and jumped into it. And 1 minute, I saw the boy. The next minute, I couldn't. They were just totally stomping him. Some guys fired shots, and all I remember was seeing the blood and thinking, this is all over hitting some stupid little girl. I didn't know what to feel that night. I ran. We all ran and found my way home in a blur. After a time, though, it didn't even matter. When you're in a gang, you see so much blood that you don't even care. It's almost like being a nurse. I'd come home with blood on my shoes, blood on my coat. My mother would say, where'd you get that coat? And I'd say, my friend gave it to me. Always some excuse. Then I'd go wash the blood off, wash my cuts and bruises. I never did get shot, thank God, and I think she doesn't even see what's going on. Forgotten youth. The way I felt was no one cared about me, and so I wasn't going to care about them. That's why I could watch somebody cry, plead, and bleed, and it wouldn't touch me. It was as if we were all on a giant totem pole, and Black people were at the very bottom, and I was totally invincible. When you feel as invincible as I felt, you can become the most dangerous person in the world because you don't even care about your own life. I knew I wasn't going to live past 18. The only thing that gave me any pride was the fact that I was in Decept. We actually had some very smart guys and some very intelligent and beautiful girls in Decept. One girl, Tangi, had been valedictorian of her junior high school class, and her parents bought her everything she wanted, but she was still missing something, and she was looking for it with us. Every one of us was troubled in some way. I was missing the mother I had known as a little girl. I had watched my mother struggling to raise us, and she was just beaten down from it, beaten down by life. She stayed inside her room most of the time. I didn't understand what was going on with her. She still went to her job every day, but when she came home, she would withdraw like she didn't really care about what I was into, and I was so angry. Another Decept girl, Nelsa, was the daughter of a heroin addict, and she had been taking care of her mother and younger siblings from the time she was 13 by working as a stripper. She would come from the club to school with a bag full of money, a fur coat, and a gun. My best friend Lisa had been born in jail. She shuttled between foster care and her mother's house till she was 8. While living with her mother, she was abused. She actually looked forward to going back into foster care. Lisa could be just cold. If you messed with her in any way, she could hurt you without blinking. Surprisingly, Lisa is now a high school special ed teacher and a mother and a wife. And Nelsa stopped stripping 2 years ago, started college, and got a job in marketing. Lisa and Nelsa and me, we all got out. Tangi didn't. Tangi became a crackhead. All that fighting and stealing eventually got me arrested, of course. When I turned 16, I was picked up for robbing some girl on the subway. I remember being handcuffed and taken to jail by these 2 black undercover cops who must have been the most gorgeous men I had ever seen in my life. And I was so embarrassed. The handcuffs were like chains around my wrists. I felt like a slave. In my head, I kept saying, "This is not you. You are not really like this." But then this other thought kept coming, "Don't fool yourself, Isis. This is you." I was in jail for a week and a half. I called my mother from the precinct house. She said, "Little girl, these people you're running with, they are not your friends. You have no friends. Your only friends are your family." But I still didn't get it. I thought Decept was my family. I loved my Decept sisters and brothers. We would do things that families did, like go to the beach and have picnics, baby showers, and dance parties. But we also went to funerals together. Members of Decept were dying all the time. Others of us were drug addicts. Still others were in jail with life sentences. And some girls had 2, 3 babies with no account guys. I was getting tired of losing everybody one by one, and beneath all the toughness, I was hurting. Finding the will to live. By age 17, I was going to funerals every week, and then Frankie got shot. He was my heart. Walking home after his funeral, I told myself this does not matter. But that night, I went to my mother's room and climbed into her bed. I needed to reach out in the dark and know she was there. The whole night, I dreamed about Frankie. The next morning, I thought I was still dreaming because my mother was standing over me. I had the weird sensation that she was looking down at me in my casket. She was crying. She said, "Isis, I want you to live. I want you to choose life. I don't want to bury you 10 feet under. I want to see your children." From that day, things began to change. I started showing up for more classes so I wouldn't get into trouble. But sometimes I just want to be with my friends and stuff would start happening. If I said I'm going home, they'd be like, "Isis, you're selling us out." When I did go to class, a couple of my teachers began taking an interest. One was my writing teacher, a black man named Mr. Mason. He encouraged me to write about what I was going through in the gang. The other one was Mrs. Beasley, a tough little 70-something black woman. Most teachers at my high school were scared to death of me, but not Mrs. Beasley. She would challenge me to try harder. One other person helped save my life, a cop. The first time John Galea saw me, the cops had pulled me in for a lineup. He cussed me out, calling me a little hoodlum. But he saw something else in me too, because he kept telling me, "Isis, you're smart, you can do better." So these 3 people hooked up with my mother and the principal of the school, and they came up with a plan. They told me that if I would go to school and keep out of trouble, they would allow me to graduate. They arranged for me to attend Fisk University, the well-known black school in Nashville. We knew I had to get out of New York because all these people who knew I didn't have Decept protection anymore were calling my house every day, threatening my family. As long as I was there, my mother and sisters weren't safe. Well, I graduated. I went to Fisk and cooled my heels for a year, but I just didn't fit in. People in Nashville still saw me as this bad New York City gang girl. I wasn't that person anymore. My consciousness had changed. So remember, that might be an important quote there, okay, how she's changed. So after a year, I transferred to the State University of New York of Stony Brook, Long Island. I met my husband-to-be, Alfonso Grant, there, a big football-playing, clean-living jock who is now a lawyer. He was so sweet to me, even after I told him my history. I think he fell in love with me because by then I had started to fall in love with myself. I was taking good care of myself, studying hard, majoring in social work, and I meditated and prayed a lot. I was beginning to understand that God had a plan for me. After college, I got married and later went on to earn a master's degree in social work at New York University. Life can be amazing. Regrets. Still, I regret all the hurt I caused. People come up to me even now with scars on their faces or bodies and they'll say, Isis, do you remember me? Some of them actually laugh when they say that, but most of them are really bitter. Like the woman I met in a store where I was buying shoes for my first job interview. A woman holding a baby comes up to me and tears are running down her face. And she has a scar on her cheek and she says, Isis, you don't know me, do you? You don't even remember what you did to me. And the horrible thing was, I didn't remember. I told her, whatever I did to you, I'm so, so sorry. She just stood there crying and shifting the baby from hip to hip. And when she saw I still didn't remember, she said, if I didn't have this baby with me, I'd kill you right now. She walked out of the store. There are faces I still see in my dreams, people we fought with who I later heard had died. I feel responsible because I was part of the violence that killed them, but I can't change what I did. All I can do now is try to give back, try to make good on this promise I made to God. I promised that if I got out of my teens alive, if God spared me, I'd use my life to help save kids like me. These days, I do one-on-one therapy with kids at risk for involvement in gangs. I get referrals through the Madison Square Boys and Girls Club, and I work with the House of the Lord Church's Community Outreach Program in Brooklyn. I do workshops in schools, and I travel the subways a lot and talk to the kids, because most New York City gangs still operate out of the subways. A whole new generation of D-subs is out there now, as well as other groups like the Latin Kings, the Crips, and the Bloods. I work mostly with gang girls. Boys with these issues do better with male mentors. The truth is, every boy and girl out there needs a mentor to help them see what choices they can make, what programs they can participate in. If you're going to tempt these kids away from the thrill of violence, and violence can be an incredible high, you have to make them understand that somebody cares about them, that they are not invisible or powerless, that their life means something. Parents in particular need to lay down clear guidelines, give their kids lots of reinforcement, and most of all, pay attention to who their kids are becoming, who their kids' friends are, what interests them. None of us is perfect. We all get worn down by life sometimes, but we have no choice but to keep on trying to reach our children. Looking back, I see that my own mother never stopped caring, though she didn't always know how to help me. And the most important thing she ever did for me was to stand at my bedside that morning after Frankie's funeral, challenging me to live.